red pill.
The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that warns you something is about to snap. I stood in the doorway of the living room, my hand still resting on the frame as I watched Clara pacing back and forth, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She didn't notice me, not yet, and that was the only reason I got to hear the raw venom in her voice. "He thinks he's so clever," she hissed, her words sharp and deliberate, designed to wound. "But trust me, I'll get every damn penny he's hiding. If the courts won't do it, I'll find another way." The floor creaked under my foot, and her head snapped toward me. Her eyes, once a source of warmth, were now filled with icy disdain. She didn't flinch or falter, just gave me that cruel, knowing smirk I'd come to despise. "How much did you hear?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with malice. "Enough," I replied, stepping fully into the room. My voice was steady, but every nerve in my body felt like a live wire. "Care to tell me what this is about, or should I just wait for the subpoena?" She hung up the phone, tossing it onto the coffee table with an air of theatrical indifference. "Oh, Jacob," she said, feigning a sweetness that made my stomach churn. "Why pretend this is a surprise? You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Hiding money. Protecting your precious little inheritance. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Her words were a slap, but they weren't unexpected. I had anticipated this moment, though I hadn't thought it would come so soon, or so viciously. "It's not your money, Clara," I said, my voice growing colder with each syllable. "It never was. My grandfather left that to me, and you know it." "Oh, spare me the righteous act," she snapped, stepping closer. "You've been lying to me for years, Jacob. Lying about our future, lying about what you provide for me. Don't you dare act like you're some victim here." I stared at her, searching for even a flicker of the person I had once loved. But there was nothing left, only the calculating, bitter woman who stood before me now. "You want the money," I said flatly. "That's all this is about." She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Of course I want it. Why shouldn't I? I wasted years on this marriage, years I can't get back. I deserve something for my trouble." The words stung, not because they were true, but because of how easily she twisted them into her own warped reality. "You're not getting it," I said simply. "No matter what you do." Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "We'll see about that," she said, brushing past me as she headed for the stairs. "You've underestimated me, Jacob. That was your first mistake." As I listened to her footsteps fade, I stood there in the silence, my mind racing. This wasn't just a fight over money anymore, it was a battle for survival. And I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't afford to lose. The next morning, I woke up with a singular purpose, to dismantle whatever plan Clara thought she had in motion. The house was eerily quiet, but her presence lingered in every shadow. I couldn't shake the image of her pacing the living room, weaving her web of lies. If she thought I'd let her win, she didn't know me nearly as well as she believed. I headed straight to my lawyer's office, a no-nonsense man named Graham. He wasn't just any attorney, he was the kind of guy who thrived on high-stakes cases and had a reputation for turning the tables on opponents. When I told him about Clara's thinly veiled threats, his expression darkened. "She's trying to claim the inheritance as marital property?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "It's a long shot, but not impossible. Depends on how it's structured." "It's not just a long shot," I said, a hint of a grin forming. "It's impossible." Graham raised an eyebrow. "Go on." I leaned forward, feeling the weight of months of preparation finally paying off. Before my grandfather passed, he and I had a long talk. He knew Clara and I were having issues, and he warned me to protect the inheritance. So, we did exactly that. Every cent of it is locked up in a trust under my parents' names. Clara couldn't touch it even if she had a crowbar. Graham let out a low whistle. "Smart. Very smart. But you know her. She'll try to paint it as a sham, claim you're hiding assets." "That's exactly why I need you to be ready," I said. "She's confident she can win, and I want to keep it that way. Let her dig her own grave." Graham nodded, already scribbling notes. "If the trust is airtight, we're in good shape. But I'll need full documentation to prove everything's above board. No room for mistakes." I had anticipated that, too. Before I left his office, I handed over a folder containing every piece of paperwork related to the trust. Graham flipped through it, his smile growing with each page. "She's not going to like this," he said, closing the folder with a satisfying thud. "You've got a solid defense. Now it's just a matter of waiting for her to make her move." As I walked out of the office, I felt a rare sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, the storm brewing in my life seemed manageable. But I knew Clara wouldn't back down easily. Her strength wasn't in strategy, it was in chaos. She thrived on throwing people off balance, on making them second-guess themselves. What she didn't know was that I was ready for the chaos. In fact, I was counting on it. When I got home, I found a legal envelope on the kitchen counter. The divorce papers. Clara had officially fired her opening salvo. But as I scanned the documents, something caught my eye, a clause demanding a full financial disclosure, including any hidden assets. I couldn't help but laugh. She thought she had me cornered, but all she'd done was play directly into my hands. Let the game begin. The courtroom was tense, the kind of atmosphere where every shuffle of paper and whispered conversation seemed amplified. Clara sat across from me, her polished appearance masking the venom I knew was bubbling just beneath the surface. Her lawyer, slick and overly confident, stood to present his case. "Your Honor," he began, oozing faux sincerity, "this isn't a simple matter of dividing marital assets. We believe Mr. Harrison has gone to great lengths to conceal a significant portion of his financial holdings, particularly an inheritance placed in a trust under suspicious circumstances." I didn't react outwardly, but inside, my pulse quickened. Graham had warned me they'd try this angle, painting the trust as a shady maneuver. What Clara's lawyer didn't know was that we were more than ready for this. "Do you have evidence to support this claim?" the judge asked, her sharp gaze cutting through the theatrics. "Not yet," the lawyer admitted, though he tried to frame it as a strategy. "Which is why we're requesting full access to the trust and any associated records. We believe discovery will reveal the truth." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Belief is not evidence," she said pointedly. "Mr. Harrison, would you like to respond?" I stood, keeping my movements deliberate and measured. "Thank you, Your Honor. The trust in question was created years before my marriage and has been under my parents' sole control since its inception. It's not part of our marital estate, and I've provided documentation to support this." I gestured to Graham, who handed a neatly prepared binder to the court clerk. Inside were the trust agreements, timelines, and notarized statements from my parents. Clara's lawyer leaned forward, his confidence visibly wavering as the judge flipped through the binder. "This documentation appears thorough," she said, her tone neutral but firm. "Unless you have evidence to contradict these records, I see no basis for granting your request." Her lawyer stumbled, attempting to regain footing. "Your Honor, we believe further investigation." "Belief, counselor, is not enough to waste this court's time," the judge interrupted. Motion denied. I stole a glance at Clara. Her expression didn't crumble, but the tension in her clenched jaw betrayed her. She wasn't used to losing. As I sat back down, Graham leaned over and whispered, "Textbook defense. She's going to hate this." Hate it she did. As we left the courtroom, Clara caught up to me in the hallway, her heels clicking furiously against the tile. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice low and venomous. "You're not as smart as you think, Jacob." I met her glare, my voice calm but steely. "Maybe not. But I'm smart enough to know you're running out of moves." Her smirk was back, sharper than ever. "You haven't seen anything yet," she said before storming off. As I watched her go, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. Clara wasn't bluffing, she thrived on chaos, and she was already planning her next attack. But if she wanted to play dirty, I'd be ready for it. Clara's fury erupted the moment she walked through the door that evening. The sharp sound of her heels on the hardwood floor echoed through the house, followed by the slam of her purse onto the counter. I was in the kitchen, pouring a drink, when her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You think you've won, don't you?" she snapped, her eyes blazing with rage. "Parading your little binder in court like that would make me back down. You're delusional." I didn't turn to face her immediately, letting the moment stretch. Finally, I set the glass down and leaned against the counter, meeting her glare with calm defiance. "It's not about winning, Clara. It's about the truth. The trust isn't yours, and it never will be. She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that made my skin crawl. Truth? You wouldn't know the truth if it hit you in the face. You've been hiding money, scheming behind my back for years, and now you want to stand there and act like you're some noble victim. Her accusations weren't new, but the venom behind them was sharper this time. I could see the cracks forming in her facade, the desperation seeping through. I didn't hide anything, I said evenly. The trust was set up before we were even married. You know that. Don't you dare patronize me, she yelled, taking a step closer. I wasted years of my life on you, years I'll never get back. Do you even understand what that feels like? Her words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because of the raw bitterness in her voice. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if there was still a shred of the woman I had fallen in love with somewhere inside her. But then she smirked, a cruel twist of her lips, and the moment was gone. You've underestimated me, Jacob, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. That was your first mistake. Underestimated you? I repeated, pushing off the counter and stepping toward her. No, Clara. I know exactly who you are now. And that's why I'm not letting you destroy what's left of this. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through the house, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door and the swirling ice in my untouched drink. The conversation replayed in my mind, each word a reminder of how far she was willing to go. Clara wasn't just angry, she was determined, and that made her dangerous. The next morning, I called Graham to update him. She's not backing down, I said. She's getting more aggressive. She's desperate, Graham replied, his tone matter-of-fact. And desperate people make mistakes. You just have to be ready when she does. I hung up the phone, his words echoing in my mind. Mistakes. Clara was bound to make them, but I couldn't rely on that alone. I needed to stay ahead, to anticipate her every move. This wasn't just a fight over money anymore, it was a battle for control, and I wasn't about to lose. The mediation room was a battlefield in disguise, its calm decor and neutral tones masking the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Clara sat across from me, her posture rigid, her lips curled in a thin, practiced smile. Her lawyer was already flipping through his notes, his face a picture of manufactured confidence. The mediator, a balding man with a soft voice, opened the session with the usual spiel about cooperation and compromise. Clara's smile widened as if she were soaking up the spotlight. I stayed silent, letting her think she had the upper hand. Let's begin with Mrs. Harrison's concerns, the mediator said, gesturing toward Clara's lawyer. He launched into his performance, painting Clara as the victim of my deceptive financial practices. According to him, I had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to shield my inheritance, effectively robbing Clara of her rightful share of our marital estate. Every word was delivered with the kind of polished conviction that could almost make you believe it. Almost. When he finally finished, the mediator turned to me. Mr. Harrison, how would you like to respond? I leaned forward, my gaze steady and deliberate. With all due respect, this narrative is fiction, I began. The trust in question was established before our marriage and has always been under my parents' sole control. It was never part of our shared assets, and the documentation we've provided confirms this beyond any doubt. I gestured toward Graham, who handed a thick folder to the mediator. This contains every relevant document, including the original trust agreements, bank records, and a notarized statement from my parents. If Mrs. Harrison has evidence to contradict these records, I'd be happy to address it. Clara's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, leaning back in her chair as if unimpressed. Her lawyer, however, didn't look so composed. He glanced at the folder with visible hesitation, clearly unprepared for the thoroughness of our defense. The mediator flipped through the documents, nodding occasionally before setting the folder down. These seem to be in order, he said, his tone neutral. Mrs. Harrison, do you have any evidence to suggest otherwise? Clara's smile vanished entirely, replaced by a hard glare. It doesn't matter what's in those papers, she snapped. He's been hiding money for years, and this trust is just part of it. He's a liar. Her outburst silenced the room. Even her lawyer looked startled, leaning in to whisper something to her, likely urging her to calm down. But Clara wasn't finished. "I've wasted my life on him," she continued, her voice rising. "He pretended to care about me, about us, but it was all a lie. And now he wants to walk away with everything." The mediator held up a hand, his expression firm. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand this is an emotional process, but we need to stick to the facts." Clara's eyes flashed, but she didn't argue. She sank back into her chair, crossing her arms tightly. Her silence wasn't defeat, it was a storm brewing. The rest of the session was a slog, with every proposal I made met with hostility or outright rejection. Clara wasn't here to compromise, she was here to fight. By the time we wrapped up, it was clear mediation wasn't going to resolve anything. As I left the room, Graham caught up to me, a wry smile on his face. "She's unraveling," he said. "That outburst didn't do her any favors." "No, it didn't," I replied, glancing back at the closed door behind us. "But she's not done yet. This was just her warm-up." And I knew it was true. Clara wasn't the type to back down gracefully. She was already planning her next move, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. The next move came faster than I expected, and it was as bold as it was infuriating. Graham called me early one morning, his tone sharp and to the point. "She's filed a lien on your parents' house," he said, not even bothering with a greeting. "She's claiming the trust is a sham and that the house is part of the marital estate." For a moment, I couldn't even process the words. "She what?" I finally managed to say. "She's dragging your parents into this, Jacob," Graham said, his voice heavy. "She knows the trust is airtight, so now she's targeting the assets linked to it." My jaw clenched, anger surging through me. This wasn't just an attack on me anymore, it was an attack on my family. Can she do that? Can she even get away with filing something like that? "She can try," Graham said. "But filing a fraudulent lien is illegal. The courts won't take kindly to it, and we can shut it down. The problem is the stress it's going to cause your parents in the meantime." That hit harder than I wanted to admit. My parents were already exhausted from being dragged into this mess, and now Clara was escalating in a way that could have real, tangible consequences for them. I felt the weight of guilt settle in my chest. "We need to get that lien removed immediately," I said firmly. "What do we do?" "First, we'll file an emergency motion to have it dismissed," Graham replied. "But we'll also take this opportunity to go on the offensive. She's crossed a line, and the court needs to see that." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Do it. Whatever it takes." The next few days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. I visited my parents to explain the situation, and though they tried to put on a brave face, I could see the strain. My father, always the stoic one, looked visibly tired, and my mother's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. "We'll get through this," my mother said, her voice steadier than I expected. "She's trying to scare us, but we won't let her win. I'll make sure of it," I promised. When the day of the hearing arrived, I was ready for a fight. Graham had prepared a rock-solid case, and we had all the evidence we needed to expose Clara's lien for what it was, a desperate, baseless move designed to intimidate. The courtroom was tense as the judge reviewed the filings. Clara sat across the aisle, her lawyer by her side, both of them feigning confidence. But as Graham presented our evidence, their facade began to crack. The judge's expression grew colder with each passing minute. "This lien is not only without merit," the judge finally said, her tone sharp and unforgiving, "but it appears to have been filed in bad faith. The court orders its immediate removal and awards legal fees to the respondents." Clara's face darkened, but she stayed silent. Her lawyer tried to salvage what little dignity they had left, mumbling something about misunderstandings, but it was clear the damage was done. As we left the courtroom, Graham turned to me with a satisfied grin. "That was a clean win. She's overplayed her hand." "Yeah," I said, glancing back at the doors Clara had just stormed through. "But she's not done." "Not yet." I wasn't wrong. Clara wasn't just losing the legal battle, she was losing control. And I knew that made her more dangerous than ever. Just when I thought Clara couldn't stoop any lower, she managed to surprise me again. It started with a late-night phone call from a friend, one of those calls you don't want to get. "Jacob," he said, his voice filled with unease, "I think you need to check your email." I opened my laptop and found it almost immediately. An email, sent to a list of people that included my coworkers, business contacts, and even some mutual friends. The subject line read, "What Jacob Harrison doesn't want you to know." My stomach twisted as I read the contents. The email was a barrage of lies, accusing me of financial fraud, hiding assets, and mistreating Clara throughout our marriage. It was a full-scale smear campaign, designed to destroy not just my reputation but my livelihood. "She's lost her mind," I muttered to myself, forwarding the email to Graham with the subject line, "We need to deal with this now." The next morning, Graham called me, sounding as furious as I felt. "This isn't just petty," he said. "It's actionable. If we can tie this email back to Clara, we can take her to court for defamation." "We both know it's her," I said, pacing the floor of my office. "No one else has this level of detail or this much spite." "Then let's prove it," Graham said. Over the next 48 hours, Graham and his team worked tirelessly to trace the email. As expected, it led back to an IP address tied to Clara's personal account. She hadn't even tried to hide it. It was the kind of brazen move that screamed desperation. But I wasn't content with just proving she sent the email. I wanted to make sure the world saw what she was capable of. So I called a friend of mine, a journalist who specialized in uncovering personal smear campaigns. "This one's a doozy," I told him, forwarding all the evidence. "Emails, court records, everything you need to write a story." He was hooked immediately, and within days, the article was published. "Ex-wife's smear campaign backfires, the truth behind the Harrison divorce," was the headline. The story laid out Clara's actions in detail, complete with the court documents and technical evidence to back it up. The fallout was swift. Clara's smear campaign turned into a public relations nightmare, her lies exposed for everyone to see. Mutual friends distanced themselves from her, and even her own lawyer filed a motion to withdraw from representing her in the divorce proceedings. I thought that might be the end of it, but Clara wasn't done yet. That evening, I got a call from her. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. "How could I do this to you?" I shot back, incredulous. "You tried to ruin my life, Clara. All I did was make sure people knew the truth." "You've ruined me," she hissed. "You'll regret this." "No, Clara," I said firmly. "The only one ruining you is yourself. Maybe it's time you face the consequences." She didn't reply. The line went dead, and I stood there in the silence, knowing this wasn't over yet. Clara might have been down, but she wasn't out, not until I saw this war through to the very end. Clara's next move wasn't just bold, it was downright reckless. A few days after the lawsuit against my parents was dismissed, I started noticing strange activity in my professional life. Clients were calling me out of the blue, asking about rumors they'd heard, and one even canceled a meeting without explanation. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I got the email. It was from an anonymous account, sent to every one of my professional contacts, colleagues, and even some mutual acquaintances Clara and I had. The subject line read, "The truth about Jacob Harrison, what he's hiding." My heart pounded as I opened it, scanning through a series of wild accusations about me, embezzling funds, hiding assets, and even cheating Clara out of her rightful share of the divorce settlement. It was a full-on character assassination, and I knew immediately who was behind it. Clara wasn't just playing dirty, she was trying to burn my entire life down. I forwarded the email to Graham, attaching a single line, "She's gone too far." He called me within minutes. "This crosses the line into defamation," he said, his voice tense. "If she's the source, we can take legal action." "She's definitely the source," I replied, pacing the room. "No one else has this kind of detail, or this much venom." "Then we hit back," Graham said, his tone sharper now. "Hard." Over the next 48 hours, Graham and his team gathered evidence, tracing the email's origin. Sure enough, it led back to an IP address linked to Clara's personal account. She hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks. But I didn't just want to expose her legally, I wanted her to feel the consequences of her actions. So, I devised a plan that would deliver the kind of blow she wouldn't see coming. First, I reached out to a close friend of mine, a well-respected journalist who specialized in exposing personal smear campaigns. I gave him everything, the email, the IP evidence, the court documents that proved her baseless claims, and the long trail of legal harassment. He was more than happy to dig in. While he worked, Graham filed a defamation lawsuit against Clara. It was aggressive, detailed, and left no room for her to wiggle out. The lawsuit demanded damages not just for me, but for the harm she'd caused to my parents and my professional reputation. Clara wouldn't just be facing a courtroom again, she'd be facing the public. A week later, the article dropped. Divorce Smear Campaign: How One Woman Tried to Destroy Her Ex-Husband and Lost. It was brutal. The piece laid out Clara's actions in painstaking detail, backed by court records and statements from people who had been targeted by her false narratives. It painted her as manipulative, spiteful, and desperate, a far cry from the image she tried so hard to maintain. The fallout was immediate. Mutual acquaintances began distancing themselves from her. Even her lawyer, likely sensing a sinking ship, filed a motion to withdraw from representing her in the divorce proceedings. I'll never forget the phone call I got from her that night. Her voice, usually so controlled and venomous, was shaking. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded. "Do what, Clara?" I said, my tone cold. "Hold you accountable. Expose you for who you really are." "You've ruined my life," she screamed. "No, Clara," I said, my voice steady. "You ruined your own life. I just stopped you from ruining mine." For the first time, she didn't have a clever comeback or a cutting retort. She just hung up, leaving me in silence. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I was finally in control. The final strike from Clara was as desperate as it was outrageous. A week after the smear campaign backfired, I received a call from Graham, his tone sharp and urgent. "She's filed another motion," he said without preamble. "She's claiming that the trust was fraudulently established with the intent to exclude her and is now demanding the court freeze your assets, including the inheritance." The audacity of her move made my blood boil. "She knows the trust is ironclad," I replied. "What's her angle?" "She's banking on dragging this out as long as possible," Graham said. "She's trying to wear you down, force you to settle just to get her out of your life." That was her game, turning the legal system into a weapon, hoping the constant stress and expense would make me cave. But what Clara didn't understand was that I was done being her target. "What do we do?" I asked. "We fight," Graham said. "Hard." The hearing was set for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, Clara doubled down, sending thinly veiled threats through her lawyer and trying to stir up more drama among our mutual friends. But for the first time, her moves felt desperate, almost frantic. She was grasping at straws, and I could see it. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture stiff, her lawyer already looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Graham, as always, was calm and collected, the picture of confidence. Her lawyer tried to spin the same tired narrative, claiming the trust was a sham, that I had orchestrated a scheme to deprive Clara of what was rightfully hers. But this time, Graham wasn't just on defense. He went on the offensive, pointing out the long trail of frivolous motions, the fraudulent lien, and the smear campaign. "This isn't a legal argument, Your Honor," Graham said, his voice steady but firm. "This is harassment, plain and simple. My client has endured months of baseless accusations and vindictive behavior. It's time to put an end to this." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the documents before her. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and precise. "The trust in question is legally sound, as this court has determined multiple times. The petitioner's continued attempts to undermine its validity lack any credible basis and appear to be motivated by personal animosity rather than legal merit. This motion is denied, and I am imposing sanctions on the petitioner for abuse of the legal process." The words hit like a hammer. Clara's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. Clara herself sat frozen, her face pale and expressionless. For all her scheming, for all her attempts to destroy me, she had nothing left. As I left the courtroom, Graham walked beside me, a rare grin on his face. "That's game over," he said. "She's got no cards left to play." I nodded, though the victory felt bittersweet. Clara had spent months trying to dismantle my life, and while she had failed, the damage she'd caused, to my peace, to my family, couldn't be undone overnight. That evening, I sat down with my parents over dinner. For the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed, shared stories, and talked about the future instead of the past. Clara had tried to take everything from me, but she had only succeeded in proving one thing, that I was stronger than she ever imagined. This wasn't just a victory, it was the end of her reign of chaos. And for the first time, I felt free.